The first shells fell before dawn, lighting the eastern edge of Mariupol with a flash that looked almost like heat lightning. Then came the concussion, deep, crushing, the kind that pushed dust from ceilings and rattled pipes under the floors. Inside a Soviet-era apartment block, families grabbed what they could carry and crowded into the stairwell, listening to glass rain down the building's face. No one knew it in that moment, but the city had already been cut off. The roads west were under fire, the cell service flickered out, and the people who lived there were trapped in a place the outside world would soon describe only in fragments. When the sun came up, smoke drifted across whole neighborhoods like fog. Streets that had been busy the week before were empty, except for burned-out trolley buses and cars with doors left open where the drivers had fled. People moved underground, basements, service tunnels, parking garages, anywhere that felt thicker than plaster and drywall. Word spread that the drama theater was taking in civilians. Others headed for the old industrial district, toward the sprawling Azovstal steelworks, because everyone knew its bunkers went deeper than any basement in the city. Azovstal covered almost 4 square miles of concrete, pipelines, cranes, chimneys, and reinforced rooms built during the Cold War. Beneath the factory ran a maze of tunnels and machine halls, some wide enough to drive trucks through, others barely large enough for a man to crawl. Within days of the assault, thousands of civilians, families with children, factory workers, pensioners who had lived in the same block their entire lives, moved into the underground levels with only what they could carry in plastic bags. They spread blankets on the concrete floors and lined up near a single water pipe that still dripped steadily. Cell phone screens lit the tunnels with a cold glow until the batteries died and darkness settled in. Above ground, the fighting tightened around the plant. Russian forces pushed in from 3 directions, closing the ring around the city. The shelling didn't come in bursts. It was constant, a rolling thunder that shook dust from the beams overhead. Every few hours, a bomb or missile struck the plant itself, the impact echoing through the steel corridors like a giant had struck the earth with a hammer. Each time, people clutched the walls and waited to hear whether the ceiling would hold. Food dwindled quickly. Volunteers cooked in small, hidden corners using scrap wood and broken pallets. A pot of thin soup had to feed dozens. Children slept in their coats, and parents tried to make a game of counting the vibrations from distant artillery to distract them from the hunger. Some mothers whispered stories to their kids to calm them, though their own voices shook. Others kept their eyes on the steel ceiling, listening to the scrape of debris sliding across it after each blast. Inside the tunnels, Ukrainian fighters moved among the civilians, passing out iodine tablets for the water and bandages for the injured. They carried radios that crackled with half-heard messages from outside the city. They tried to map the bombardments, predicting where the next strike would fall. Many had already been fighting for weeks without rotation, their faces gray with exhaustion and smoke. But they kept watch on the upper levels, climbing into ruined buildings to spot incoming aircraft and mark damaged ventilation shafts that still needed to be cleared. In March, the drama theater, where hundreds of civilians had been sheltering, was struck. The blast rolled across the city, felt even inside the depths of Azovstal. People huddled closer together in the tunnels after that, because the message was clear. Any place could be hit, no matter what was written on the pavement outside. They listened for news, but the radios only captured fragments. Every update made the air feel heavier, the hope thinner. Weeks passed. Fire cracked across the plant's surface day and night. An entire section of the roof collapsed after a direct hit, sending dust and twisted steel down into a service corridor. Civilians closest to the impact were pulled out by hand, coughing and blinded by the debris. They were patched up with whatever supplies remained. One nurse, a former clinic worker from the Eastern District, kept track of the wounded in a notebook, flipping through pages by flashlight until the battery finally died. Spring crept across the plains outside, but the people underground didn't see it. They knew the season had changed only because the air above grew warmer. The fighters rationed their ammunition, waiting for opportunities to strike back, slipping through smashed doorways and shell craters to hit positions on the outskirts before retreating again. At night, explosions lit the city in short, violent bursts visible through the shattered openings of the upper levels. By late April, smoke from burning warehouses drifted into the lower tunnels, forcing families to press wet cloths to their faces. Supplies ran out completely. The last bags of grain were ground by hand with pieces of broken concrete. Parents gave their rations to their children. Some people collapsed from exhaustion, waking only when a new blast shook the ground hard enough to knock dust from the pipes. When evacuation corridors finally opened, they came with no guarantees. Still, civilians gathered in lines that snaked through the tunnels, clutching children and bags packed with whatever fragments of their old lives they could still carry. They climbed out through a jagged gap in the factory wall, stepping over twisted steel and scorched earth. As they crossed into the open air, many blinked against the sunlight. They hadn't seen the sky in weeks. Some were helped by soldiers with soot-stained hands who had kept watch over them through every bombardment. Others needed to be carried. What remained of the fighters stayed behind in the steelworks, holding their dwindling positions so the last families could make it out. They moved deeper into the plant as more sections collapsed or caught fire, each blast shaking the ground like a drumbeat. At night, they listened to distant engines, knowing the perimeter had tightened again. By the time the final defenders laid down their arms, Mariupol was barely a city anymore. Whole neighborhoods had been reduced to ash, and broken brick streets were lined with wreckage, and smoke still rose from the industrial district. The tunnels of Azovstal, once a place of work, had become a refuge, a hospital, a place where thousands survived on almost nothing, while the world tried to understand what had happened. Months later, people who had escaped still talked about the darkness underground, the constant rumble above, and the moments when they thought the ceiling would finally give way. They remembered the smell of steel and smoke, the cold concrete under their feet, and the quiet ways strangers took care of one another. They remembered the city before the siege, too, the markets, the parks, the harbor, and how quickly all of it disappeared into fire. The siege did not just erase buildings from the map, it scattered the people who lived there, leaving them to rebuild their lives far from the place they had called home. But for those who survived the tunnels, the memory of Azovstal remained as clear as the day they left it. A place where they held out in the dark, waiting for a moment when the world above would finally open again. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.